So in this video, we're going to pick up where we left off talking about Hitler, and we're going to start in 1929. So in 1929, we see the Great Depression sweeping not only the United States, but also much of Europe. And the important effect for the Great Depression is that it's going to fundamentally weaken or expose the weaknesses of the Weimar government, particularly along the lines of the Reichstag and how it organizes its government. So from 1930 to 1933, we see a series of very weak, very unpopular chancellors. This begins in 1930 with the von Brüning government. So von Brüning, he's appointed chancellor by Hindenburg, but it's a weak government. He's not very popular with the Reichstag. He doesn't do a really effective job of managing legislation. And so Hindenburg has to use Article 48, and remember Article 48 is what grants him emergency powers. So think about emergency powers to pass legislation without the Reichstag's approval. And so Hindenburg has to use this special article several times because he otherwise can't get laws passed. Now, von Brüning is a moderate chancellor. He tries to do basic things to deal with the effects of the Great Depression, increasing the social welfare state, increasing government services, continuing government spending, but all that fails to really ameliorate the problems caused by the Depression. He's eventually dismissed by Hindenburg, and a new, more conservative prime minister, or a new, more conservative chancellor is appointed in July of 1932, and that's von Papen. Von Papen is even less popular than von Brüning. Can't get legislation passed. He's now coming from a more conservative side of the spectrum, and because the Reichstag is made up of several really small parties from all over the political spectrum, the government simply can't function. So eventually, Hindenburg is going to call for a general election in 1932. So the first general election he calls for is in July, and in that general election, the Nazis win a majority of the seats. They win 230 seats. Well, so what does this tell us? Well, this tells us that they're growing in popularity. They're popular with the German middle class and beginning to be popular with some of the sort of the upper echelons of the working class. And they're a really prominent political organization. Hindenburg doesn't really like the Nazis, doesn't really like Hitler. He calls for a second general election in November, and in that general election, only 196 seats are captured by the Nazis. Now, that's still a lot of seats. They still are one of the largest majority parties in the Reichstag, but this indicates sort of a slacking or weakening of their popularity. Now, after the general election, we see the appointment of the von Schleicher government. So this is another more conservative government appointed by Hindenburg. And during this government, we see sort of a crisis within the Nazi party. So this is a crisis for the Nazis. So the party is seen to be weak. They decline in popularity from July to November. The party is seen to be split between a left wing and a right wing. And remember, that might sound confusing because obviously the Nazi party is clearly right wing, but there's more moderate left-wing Nazis and then more radical right-wing Nazis. And because of their campaigning in the general election, the party was broke. They didn't have a lot of money, and so there was sort of this crisis of leadership and then crisis of organization. Now, things are going to change really shortly in 1933. In 1933, Hitler is going to be appointed chancellor of the Reichstag. Now, why does that happen? Well, there's a couple things that happen that allow Hitler to be appointed. The first is that there's going to be constant conflict between the von Schleicher government and Hindenburg. So there's going to be scheming and plotting between really von Papen, Hindenburg, and von Schleicher. The second is there's this need to form a coalition within the Reichstag. So the Reichstag only really functions with a majority coalition. Now that could be one party or that can be several larger parties. And so to have a functional electable government, well, you need a coalition. And who has a very large number of seats? Well, it's the Nazis with all their 196 seats. So by January, they're too big to ignore. There's also this belief, and this belief was shared by Hindenburg, von Papen, that Hitler was weak at this moment. So they saw that the party was in decline, they saw the party was split, and Hitler was simply someone that they could deal with, they could manage. And famously, and I think this is credited to von Papen in 1933, he said, "We have him boxed in. We can control Hitler now. We bring him into the government, but we can control and contain him." Well, and the reason they think this is because of the 11 ministers in the Chancellor's government, only 3 of them would be Nazis. So the rest of the 11 would be moderates or more sort of left-wing elements. So they genuinely believed that in 1933, when Hitler was appointed Chancellor, that this is something that's containable. Hitler is simply kind of a fringe wacko. They can deal with him. And notice here, this is when he's appointed Chancellor. He's appointed by Hindenburg, and he's no longer in military uniform. He's in civilian dress. And he looks like a normal politician. Well, looks can be deceiving, and in 1933 we really don't know what's going to happen in less than a year and a half. What happens, and this is less than a month, is the Reichstag fire. So in February 1933, the Reichstag is set on fire. It's actually an act of arson. For several years there was a belief that Hitler somehow sort of staged this, but it actually turns out that it was legitimate attempted arson. The Reichstag was set on fire by a Dutch communist. And this is the moment that Hitler can use